Hey, this is Eric Sietzema from Big Sandy Church of God in Big Sandy, Montana. And this week, for our fourth teaching video, which is late, I'm sorry, I know it's late. I planned it and started it and then wanted to redo it and wasn't sure exactly the right way to tackle this topic. And so, it is late because of me. I just could not decide on how to arrange this. And this is probably the fifth time I've revised it and attempted to re-record it. And so hopefully this will be the one. This week, we're going to look at an argument, a claim, and we're going to sort of address and refute it. And in doing so, we're going to talk about the Bible as a piece of evidence specifically, because we've talked about what the Bible is and where it came from, and we've talked about translations and manuscripts and the accuracy of the stuff that's been handed down to us. And so as we kind of move on, we're going to look at just what it is that that the Bible is like as a piece of evidence. And the argument we're going to address is it's a simple one, and it sounds so good until you start digging into it and you realize that there's not a whole lot there. The argument is you cannot use the Bible to prove the Bible. So like the idea, sort of the envisioning of folks who think this is a great argument, is, well, God is real. Well, how do you know? The Bible says he's real. Well, how do you know the Bible is telling the truth? Because the Bible tells us it's telling the truth. Well, that's a circular argument. And it seems clever. You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. The problem is that it's committing what's called a category error. A category error is where you take something and you misassign it to the wrong thing, and you treat it like something it isn't, as a way of attacking or disproving it. And in this case, the misappropriation, or the category error, is treating the Bible as though it is a monolith, like it is one thing, and that this one single book presents just claims like esoteric and abstract and just ideas about who God is. The problem with that argument is that's not what the Bible is. The Bible is actually a collection of documents. It is 66 different documents, maybe 67. There's a possibility that one of Paul's letters is actually two letters. It might not be. I mean, it's all guesswork at that point. But it's generally assumed to be 66 different documents written by some 40-odd people, and that book presents evidence that is not just truth claims that stand on their own. It presents arguments and eyewitness accounts of actual historic events. And so it's not as though somebody says, oh, well, let me tell you that Jesus is the only way to heaven, and, he's up on Mount Olympus, and, and all this other stuff, really abstract claims, like Matthew, for example. Matthew knew Jesus, and he tells what he saw, heard, and encountered in his life as a part of knowing Jesus. That would be an eyewitness account. That's not you don't prove an eyewitness account with an eyewitness account. It's proof on its own. And it is proof of the life of Christ. And so as we dive into this, we're going to talk, first off, we got to talk about evidence, and that is unavoidable. When it comes to history and how history is understood, we know history through sources. Anything that we know that happened, the Battle of Waterloo, or the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or the assassination of JFK, or whatever. There are primary and secondary sources associated with those events, and that's how we know things about the past. And so, real quick, a primary source is a first-hand account or something that came from came from the individual being talked about, or the events, or what have you. It is a for example, in D.C. at the George Washington Masonic Temple, they have George Washington's desk. That is a primary artifact. Like, it is a primary source because it's an artifact of George Washington's life. I read a few years ago Mark Twain's autobiography. Mark Twain is a primary source about Mark Twain. Like, he can write a story, he can write his own history, and to some degree, it's authoritative. I mean, he might exaggerate or whatever, but that is an eyewitness account. And so primary sources for the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, his teachings, the whole 9 yards, from the Bible. We're just going to look at the New Testament, right? We have 2 full books that are primary accounts, like histories that are primary accounts. You have the book of Matthew, and Matthew is a primary account. Matthew is a guy who knew Jesus. He is an individual who shows up in the story and he is told about. Matthew is a primary eyewitness. And so when Matthew makes claims about Jesus, those claims are authoritative because he's a witness. Much more so than if I were to wake up tomorrow morning and say, well, Jesus had red hair, or he had 6 fingers on each hand or something like that. I don't know that. I didn't know Jesus. I didn't see him. Whereas Matthew is saying, I knew Jesus. This is what I saw. This is what I experienced. So that's Matthew. And John. The Gospel of John is written by John. John is a major figure in the Scriptures. He wrote 2 New Testament books, but he's also the guy who was present at the crucifixion of Jesus. So the information that we have about the crucifixion, from John, is straight up eyewitness. He was at the trial of Jesus. He was able to get in because he knew the guy at the gate, and he talks about that. So the book of John is a primary account. So that is 2 primary accounts that appear in the Bible. So that's 2 eyewitnesses. There are other primary accounts included, and so it doesn't just stop there. Part of the book of Acts is a primary account. It was written by Luke. Luke was a doctor. He traveled with Paul, and he was an eyewitness to a number of events in the text because he was there. He's a character in the story, and he talks about himself being there. And so that's Luke. Luke is a history, or Acts is a history, and about half of it is primary account. Paul almost certainly knew Jesus before his trial, and Paul saw Jesus resurrected. That makes Paul an eyewitness. And Paul, he didn't write a gospel, he wrote a bunch of letters, and he talks about Jesus, and he talks about the resurrection. He talks about things that he saw. And that's a big deal because those are primary accounts of the life of Jesus. So when somebody says, oh, there's no proof that Jesus ever lived, not really. There are a bunch of eyewitnesses. So we have Paul, right? We also have Peter, who wrote several letters and talks about Jesus. We've got James, who was Jesus' half-brother, and saw him resurrected as well. So Peter and James saw him resurrected. Those 2 guys are primary sources. Jude, the guy who wrote Jude, is a primary source. So we have a bunch of these primary source accounts, or mentions, or acknowledgments, or addresses to the life of Christ. That's a lot. And we talked about it before, our copies of these documents go all the way back to the beginning. They are not things that, the earliest copy we have is 1,000 years later, or we know what John says because the book of John is lost in history, but it was quoted by Irenaeus, and so we have that through Irenaeus. Nope, we have primary eyewitness documents. The second kind of source is what's called a secondary source. So a secondary source is somebody who wasn't there, but takes information from primary sources and puts it out as a collection. Like, it is a secondhand account of events, or things that turn up many years later. Usually, like an example of this would be a true crime book. I've read a few of these in the last few years, and the author will go and he'll interview people who are there, or he will read police reports, or read court testimony of witnesses, and those are secondary sources. Those are primaries, and he's taking the primaries and relating them to us as secondary sources. There are two major secondary sources, and they are contemporary to the life of Jesus as they appear in the Bible. We have the book of Luke, which is a secondary source straight up. Luke doesn't pretend that he was there. He writes an account based on research and interviews and investigations. The book of Luke is like the investigative report of the New Testament. And Luke says that in the beginning of his book. He says, well, Theophilus, I'm sending you all of this stuff I learned when to tell you what happened. And Luke goes around and he interviews people. That's actually probably the reason that Luke has more information about the birth of Jesus, is because he probably went and talked to Mary. And we know he was around John, and Mary went to live with John after the crucifixion. And so we know that Luke had access to her and was able to interview her. He interviewed a lot of people, and his account is based on this research that he did. And finally, Mark. The book of Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. It may be the first one written, though there's a really minority argument about that. It's generally accepted as the first one that was written. And Mark was not an eyewitness. Mark traveled with Peter. He was Peter's like guy, and he took Peter's preaching notes and wrote them out. And so he has a primary source that he knew personally. He didn't read Peter's writings and write them down. He knew Peter, and he wrote down what Peter said, which makes it a pretty strong secondary source. And so what we have is both primary and secondary sources. We have 5 to 6 primary sources. I lost track as I counted. Let's see. Matthew, John, some of Luke is primary source. We have the writings of Paul. We have the writing of James. We have the writing of Peter. And we have the writing of Jude. That's actually 7. And so we have 7 primary accounts of the life of Christ. And they're not lost. They're not quoted in other books. They are straight up, we have these books. So that is our primary sources. Our secondary sources, we have a handful. And actually, if you step beyond the scriptures, there's a bunch more. The Talmud talks about Jesus. He is mentioned in the Talmud several times. They're not very pleasant. We're not going to talk about him today. That'll be a future video. Josephus mentions Jesus, and there's some controversy about that, but at the core of it, he did mention Jesus. We have Roman historians who reference the crucifixion of Jesus. We have, all kinds of these specific things that took place. In addition, we have locations, and it's kind of interesting how that worked out. We are able to say this is where Jesus was born. The Church of the Nativity is built over where Jesus was born. Well, how do we know it's really built over where Jesus was born? Well, in the early church, Bethlehem was a pretty important place because Jesus was born there. And so believers would gather in these places, at the place where Jesus was born, and they could just go and ask the people in the town, hey, remember Mary? Remember when she had that baby here? Where'd that happen? Oh, over there? And they'd gather in these places, and they would worship. And a lot of the early churches were these locations. The place where the crucifixion took place, the place where the angel visited Mary and told her that she was pregnant. There are a few others, these actual historic places, and those things that have been uncovered there, what have you, they're primary or secondary source locations. But the way we know where those are is the early church would gather in those spots, and the Emperor Hadrian came along, and he didn't like the Christians, and he wanted to kind of stamp it out. And so Hadrian initiated this persecution of believers. And when he did that, one of the ways he discouraged believers from gathering was he went to their holy places and he built pagan temples on them. And then several hundred years later, or 100 years later, in 324 AD, Helen, who was the mother of Emperor Constantine, she went to Israel and she traveled around and she talked to people, and she said, well, where was Jesus born? Well, that's easy. We all remember that. They built that pagan temple over it. And, so we know where Jesus was born, because Hadrian, in an effort to stamp out Christianity, preserved locations for many of the important events that took place. That's a big deal, because there's an awful lot of ancient history we can't tell you where it happened. We can't point and say that's the spot. And 324, by the way, 324 is pretty close to the lifetime of Jesus as far as things go. So if people are able to say Jesus was born over there, or the crucifixion happened over there, if they're able to say that, they know that because generationally people told each other and said, oh, well, that Jesus guy. None of these guys, a couple hundred years later, are saying, yeah, that Jesus guy was made up, my grandma told me, because she lived here and she never saw him. The story of Christ couldn't have survived in these locations because, no matter what, you cannot convince people that they saw something they didn't, or met a person that didn't exist. These are strong primary and secondary supports for the life of Christ. And there are a bunch of others, and we'll talk about that in a future video.